over here is 10 and anarcho-primitivism is 1. I'm like a 3, 4.
Okay.
Like 3.5. I believe in technology and I want technology. What does technology mean? But like basically, just to give an example, like I feel like everyone on Earth could have access to a bicycle, a train link, a mobile, a fridge, a washing machine, cooking equipment, and obviously house and like that level of technology, everyone should have access to, and we can do without doing any significant destruction to the Earth, as far as I'm aware. I don't think we need much more than that. We don't need more technology, basically, is my basic perspective. We need to share what we already have. There will not be another technology on Earth that can feed as many people as the tractor, for example. We just need to have more tractors. We don't need a new form of energy. We can use windmills and turbines and this and that, and we can reduce our energy consumption. And there are places for fusion and geothermal and mass solar where that is a place we can use all those things, but we don't need new technologies, is my perspective. I like Ivan Illich's approach to technology. He was like the 60s or 70s sociologist in the States that like basically, as far as I understand it, came up with the term medicalization, or at least popularized. He talked about deschooling society. That's also basically his idea. And he wrote another book called Tools for Conviviality, and that's thinking about what technology is useful for humans and which ones create more problems than they solve. And he gives this archetype of the bicycle. Bicycle is a great piece of technology because you convert human power, human muscle, into more effective work. You can go much further on a bicycle than you can on foot, but there's no extraneous energy sources, so you're not dependent on them. So like with cars, you're dependent on the petrol industry, and so therefore you're dependent on the petrol empire and invading Iraq and the tar sands and all this kind of other nonsense, just to keep yourself able to go to work, and that means you've got an interest in that.
And we see these kind of hideous knock-on effects of mining and things like this on the communities around them and the ecosystems around them and stuff like this, that goes far beyond things which we could change just by doing society differently. Like we could change the working conditions of people that live in mines. That could be part of something's theoretically possible utopia, but can we change the effect that has on the Earth without having to change so much that it would maybe make more sense just to not do it in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, that's to some extent a technical question, which I don't have the answer to. Like, can you do gold mining without poisoning everywhere with mercury or some shit? Like, I mean, I don't know. But there's the other sense in terms of what technology does to us to be dependent on it. So, like a really classic example is biomedical, Western, allopathic, whatever you want to call it, medicine, introduced more and more technology over the course of the 20th century and has become like this commodity seller for like the second biggest industry in the world after the arms industry, the pharmaceutical industry. It doesn't just sell medicines, it sells hospital beds and hospital equipment and, life support machines and all this sort of commodification. And it also sells medical testing. So the idea that you can have an objective marker of your health means blood tests, means x-rays, means MRI scans, means ever more technology of diagnostics. And I'm not saying that any of that stuff is bad. Most of it is fucking amazing that we have access to it. But when you use that technology, you see people through the lens of that technology. It's a way to abstract the healer from the patient, from the person, and turns people into numbers and statistics and sort of objective markers, which don't really work very well. From just the clinical medical perspective, it doesn't work very well as a way of thinking about it. It's also dehumanizing, and it also aids in like all sorts of like really horrific stuff that's happened in history. But importantly, it's not very good from the point of view of clinical care. It's useful to have some of that technology. Lots of it's very interesting. X-rays are like an incredible thing. And there's loads of it that's really incredible, but it changes the way you view the person. It alters the relationship. And if you have an economic system that's based around commodities, then the use of the technology has a higher priority than what is actually better for the patient. So in a capitalist system, having that kind of technology means that you have to use the technology. Once you have to use the technology, then you try and force people into the lens of that technology. So that's just to give an example, but I think that's true all over the place. So Ivan Illich's example is the car. In America, suburban America, since the 50s and 60s, has been built around the idea that every family will have a car. So the urban planning, therefore, everything's built around the fact that you have a car, which means you can't not have a car, which means you are bought into the oil industry and the invasion of Iraq and all the other things by default just to live your daily life. From a distribution point of view, you want lots of local things that are all connected to each other, but you don't want, we saw in the pandemic, the supermarket shelves were emptying, not because there wasn't enough food, but because they couldn't stack the shelves fast enough, right? And that's because there's a distribution problem. Everything goes into the center and then is redistributed. And that's how you do it if you're having a sort of hierarchical or centralized economy, which you have to do in certain places because of geography, but like you don't always have to do that. And our economy is built around it. But for us in our mind, so moving closer to what I want to see in terms of a utopia, is sort of distributed communities that are much smaller than the current sort of cities that we've got now. I mean, some will be big, that's fine, but by and large, like distributed communities that are arranged around a group of people that is more or less autonomous in size, that most people know each other and can coordinate decisions at the local level. So I don't know, in my head, I've got somewhere between like a couple of thousand and 10 to 20,000 in terms of like what is a good arrangement unit, and those arrangement units federated. Each of those units would have enough land to feed itself and be more or less capable of feeding itself, not all the time, not self-sufficiently. They'd be exchanged with everyone around, but each area of organisation should more or less be able to feed itself if it needs to.
There's no reason most of the time that you should have to be self-sufficient, but you can imagine that a situation, some sort of catastrophic situation would mean that you do have to be, and that's fine because you can.
Yeah, exactly. And also it means that no one can starve each other out in any way, right? Like right now, London has basically conquered the south of England and much of the world, and like has everything coming in to it to feed it, right? And like then controls those areas and has a strategic control, like takes so much of the funding that exists in the current system, goes to London, and it doesn't go to other places because they've got power there. And if you've got a more distributed system, that's much harder to do. If every community can feed itself, you can't force them to do what you want, right? Like if they don't want to do it, they're self-sufficient. So that's one thing. And I do want technology, but we've got a particular mentality about what technology is, which is basically metalwork more and more complex, right? Like the newest technology is the most complex metalwork you can imagine. And what we don't think of as technology is everything else that is equally technology, which is forms of communication and weaving, and materials and other things. And there's no reason that technology has to stop just because we stop going this one direction. We've been going for a very long time. We've developed the technologies of permaculture, and we developed the technologies of living in amongst the land, basically, rather than consuming and devastating the land. Yeah, stewardship of the land as a basic premise. The fact that where you live, you're responsible for maintaining that land because that's the land you're living from, so you kind of have to. And I mean, just as a side note, it's been super interesting to learn about the whole history of witchcraft in this country and the commons and how people used to live. and realised that in exactly the same way as the Pilgrims, took over the land in the Americas. First, the land was taken from the working classes here by barons, basically, by privateers who built hedges so they could keep sheep and force people off the land. And the reason, in my opinion, that English mentality around food and land is so warped is because the English don't have access to the land. Like, there's something like 6% of the land that's actually available to the public. So much of it is owned by the aristocracy and so on. But people are not actually aware of it because they don't see, they can't tell, and they don't have access to it, so they can't kind of look at it themselves.
So this statistic, by the way, so I can't remember exactly what it is, but when you say land that's accessible to the public, obviously a small amount of land that's not accessible to the public is people's homes and stuff like this, but that makes up like 1% of the land that's not accessible to the public.
Yeah, and the same amount, but the same percent, like it's the same amount of land that's given over to golf courses as housing, which is insane. Like, the idea that Britain is full is like absolutely insane. But from the point of view of feeding ourselves, and I think everywhere should have food sovereignty, localized production is much more sustainable. The history of Britain is, and particularly England, is that more than 50% of the food in this country has been imported since about 1750. So people eat more foreign food than local food, and have done for 250 years or more, which means that we're not connected to our food system, we're not connected to our land in the same breath as like they've taken away the commons and stuff. We don't know how food grows. We don't know what food grows when. We don't know the seasonality. We don't know our local produce. We don't know anything really about farming life or in this country, farmers are killing themselves and like have very high rates of suicide, have very poor mental health, and it's partially because they've got backbreaking work that no one thanks them for, that you can't feed yourself on because the prices are pushed down so low. And they're all in debt, and they can't buy more land because the land is bought up by property developers building luxury flats, which is exactly not what we need. And they're not even building them; they're just buying the land. Like, the law makes it much easier for property developers to buy land than farmers. Like, it's cheaper, and so they're speculating on it and pushing house prices up. In the meantime, we don't have a connection to our food, our land, our plants, our ecology.
And that hasn't been the case for, almost all of human history and our history as biological organisms before then. So we're evolved to be consuming food that's grown near to us in this seasonal cycle and so on. Like, there are foods that you eat them at the time of year that they would naturally become available in your environment, and that catalyzes a bunch of biological processes to prepare you for the coming season. Like when you eat fruit that's ready at the end of summer, it kickstarts your body to start storing fat for the winter, and vice versa when you eat fruit that's available at the start of the summer. So there are these incredibly complex relationships that we have as organisms to the other organisms that we're in a constant interaction with, that have been totally disrupted by the kind of supply chain of food that we have today. That means that we're just not functioning the way that we've always functioned, and so we're not functioning as well, as we're not as well adjusted anymore to our environment as we have been and could be, and you could say are supposed to be. Like, there's no reason that we shouldn't be perfectly adjusted to our environment.
Yeah, that's what evolution is meant to provide for us, really. And in a sense, we do become adjusted to the new environment, right? It's just unhealthy in lots of ways, and one of which is like lots of the health conditions we get in terms of allergies and food intolerances. We're not presenting to our own immune system through our food the local how do you call it, the allergens, the local pollens and the local things that trigger asthma and hay fever and eczema and stuff, and so it's not really surprising that we have very high rates of immune conditions.
Because if you are eating food that's grown in the same kind of soil that's in your garden, and the fertilizers from animals that have eaten food that's grown in
Yeah.
that kind of soil, and like the air and the water and so on, all of the bacteria that those crops have used to make themselves are the same ones that you're constantly in contact with.
Yeah.
Then I'm not sure what's the next step of what I'm saying.
That just seems healthier in all ways, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's kind of the way that everything naturally operates on the earth when left to its own devices. And then when people who, people hundreds of years ago who didn't have like any particular theoretical knowledge of how this works, came along and said, well, this might work much better actually if we did it like this, if we moved all of this to over here and that to over here and stuff like that, and like so that we can make everything more legible, more taxable, higher production and so on. They weren't aware of everything that was happening that was really important that they would lose by doing that, and we've been left like living in the shell of this like quite primitive system of like managing resources.
Where we could be living in food forests.
Yeah, and in a situation that's like incredibly complex, like like intelligent organic system that's developed itself over billions of years. Instead, we're living in this very primitive system that's just developed by some guys in the 17th century or something.
Let's do rows of grass. That's the best way to feed people. And then like we get foods like deficiencies, nutritional deficiencies, and we're like, let's put a vitamin in the grass instead of like, well, let's have a complex diet, and like there's loads of things that get kicked out of the diet in that process as well, like bitter foods and things that we just don't have in the palate, and we've become completely addicted to sugar and all these other colonial produce so that we can ignore these things basically, and then we have diabetes and we have lots and lots of problems.
And stuff like this.
And sort of along with this very primitive farming system that we've developed in order to produce maximum profits, not yields. Although they thought they were doing yields, it's not. When you have a look at how you grow permaculture, it's just yields of different things.
It doesn't actually produce higher yields. It's based on what some people who had very little understanding of growing thought would produce higher yields.
Yeah.
And then that's what we've just stuck with.
Yeah, and
once you've cut down all of the ancient old growth forests, you can't just be like, oh, okay, we'll replant them tomorrow.
I like to imagine that we're building our cities and our communities in amongst the land. We don't see ourselves as separate from nature because we're not, and we have all sorts of ways that we innovate to minimize our impact on the local environment and to work with the environment to benefit the environment in various ways. Like I like the idea of just one idea, like to imagine it is like you build the city on stilts, and so all the animals, whatever the bears and the horses can go underneath, and you're up on this platform, and here are the trees next to the alley, your pathways and so on, and cities on multiple levels because that's fun. And instead of roads, you've got canals everywhere because when you're not doing a just-in-time distribution system, you don't need to get there fast. You want to get there at a reasonable rate in a way that like is incorporating the nature. So we've got canals in our cities and we've got nature in our cities because of that. We've got fresh water everywhere, and we're looking after the water. And where human sewage is not being flushed into the sea, it's being used as compost. And like stuff that's just really obvious and beneficial, and that we're turning into a massive problem because I don't know, because of this like absolute anti-life mentality that we have. But also to do with the thing you were saying about the different fruits you eat in different seasons and how that affects your body. Like it's also a question of the society I want is essentially more pagan, because the scientific thing to do is to pay attention to the seasons, right? Like, we have this thing called seasonal affective disorder, and it makes me like want to just like scratch out my head because. So you're saying that enormous stellar orb of nuclear fire from which all life, including the planets, come from. So you're saying the activity of this thing, the cosmic mother, father of us all, might have an effect on your mood. When it's like, are you like,
Well,
it's nuts, you know. It's
you
like
started paying attention, kid.
it's like, wow, yeah, like, you mean all of nature has seasonality, like the plants, the animals, that, like, you know, obviously not the equator so much, but like in this part of the world, all of nature has seasonality. And you think humans are beyond that?
I mean, there's
Like-
still seasonality at the equator, but seasonality is different there because they're at a different angle to the sun.
I don't know. There's different seasons,
Maybe
different parts.
seasonality is not the right word to use, but there's still
You've got dry season and
It's still in the
monsoon
world,
season in some
a
places.
relationship to
Yeah,
the other things in the world that affects the way that things are there.
yeah,
I mean, that seems fairly basic. Like, wherever you are, you're in a relationship to the other things affecting each other.
yeah.
That's just that's how it is here in the world.
Yeah, but humans have gone into the human bubble where we have human time and human calendars and human, you know, human smell, and like we're just choking on the humanness of us, because like when you're, you know, you want to be amongst other creatures and amongst the other plants, because you don't want to just breathe yourself all the time, you know. You don't want to be in a cubicle just breathing yourself. You want to be interrelating with the whole world, and that's healthier and it's happier and it's saner and it's like more mystical and magical and spiritual.
And it's also just how we've always done things and how everything else has always done things, you know. So I can feel it like a vitamin deficiency if I haven't been around plants and animals and like a variety of different types of life. Like if I've been spending time in a city, and maybe I've just been spending a lot of time in the house or something like this, like there are lots and lots of things that are lacking in that situation. And like when I come back into contact with one of them, like I can feel it, like, oh, that particular lack has now been replenished. Oh yes, I've seen a bunch of colours, like of different flowers now, like my body really needed to absorb those light frequencies, and now it's got to.
Yeah, life is also not a static thing, and we're in a system whose underlying logic is to try and make everything as repeatable and predictable as possible, so that it can process it, so it can predict it and control it. And what's it called? Like the technology of frontiers is one of like transmitting a qualitative idea into a quantitative one, right? So like you're not just a human who's trying to travel to a place, you are passport number XYZ, so that it can decide how much to tax you, whether you're allowed in, this, that and the other. Like states and borders have to make you readable, and like and any system, any bureaucratic system will try and reduce people to a number or a word that it can quantify or measure in order to control you and decide what to do with you, rather than just letting humans and nature do what they would do. And so the logic of that system is to compartmentalize everything, like the sort of OCD trait of like splitting up your plate into all the different ingredients because you don't want them mixed up. Like there was this fascinating study they did in Spain during the elections, where they polled people on what political party they were voting for and how they liked their Spanish omelette, like on the, you know, the tortilla, the national dish. And they didn't find a lot of correlations, but there was one correlation that stuck out, which was if you voted for the fascist party, Vox, you tended to like your Spanish omelette very dry, fewest ingredients, because the like typical Spanish omelette is sort of liquid in the middle. It's like gooey, and it's like, and people put onions and other things in it, and you know, whatever, you just. But it's like the mindset of the people who vote fascist is like the white people in the white box and the black people in the black box, and they, you know, like they come up with all these fucking legislation of like apartheid and like racial segregation because the idea of mixing is somehow disgusting to them, right? Like anything that isn't clearly solid over there, liquid over here, you know, like anything that's like the wheat should all look the same and I have to buy the same product, and you have, you know, whatever definition you have, they've got to put it into their little boxes, and that's the like, you know, very left hemispherical, the anatomist sort of way of saying things, break everything apart into its constituent molecules, like Huel. Huel is the ultimate technology of this. Like I don't need to eat, I don't need to take in anything else. I have all my essential nutrients, as if like what humans need is just like Lego building blocks in order to be human. You can do that with like some toast, and you can do that with like, you know, bread is already an ultra processed food.
Yeah.
Like we just don't, and like pasta and things like that. There's loads of things you can eat quickly. You can eat sushi quickly. You know, it's not like, but like.
Or leftovers.
But you're right. Like it's not just about the nutrients of the thing. It's like it's the ritual of community also that they're trying to break down. And they're also trying to get you off of nature time, i.e. time, and into human time, i.e. some shit that we made up that makes everyone unhappy, right? Like it's.
But I don't like calling it human time, because I think that humans, we're capable of being a really good part of nature.
Yeah.
And like, it's not like when we're born, we're like wake up at 6 o'clock and make sure I get to work. You know, like we learn that, we're taught that. It's not. Human isn't the thing that defines that way of being. Yeah.
I'm saying human time because I'm saying divorced from the rest of the natural world.
The way that I think of it is like Babylon time, the series and today one, because it's like Babylon, you know, like from kind of Rasta mythology or whatever, but also the Babylonians are the guys who came up with the system of time that's based on 12 hours a day and 12 hours a night. I
didn't know that. Yeah, Babylon time. You could also call it church clock time. Yeah. You know, like
civilization time.
Yeah, well, not just civilization, because the kind of time we're on now is the one that is the descendant of the churches going up in Western Europe and deciding what time was. Because at least in Islam, you've got, you know, sunrise and sunset meditation, meditation and prayer, I guess, a ritual, which is still, you know, facing the outside world, whereas in Christian time, you're just facing this mechanical thing, the clock face. Like that's the thing that rules your life.
And maybe part of it is because of this idea in Christianity that you're not supposed to revere the creation. That's like idolatry.
You're meant to revere the book, the religion of the book, the good book, and
you're
in
meant
which
to revere this thing that you can only access through what, like, I mean, it's not through some kind of spiritual process, right? Because it's dangerous to step into the spiritual realm. That's like black magic and stuff. I guess it's through this one guy who's been told that
Caesar.
He's allowed to access divinity, and then he'll let you know about it.
Yeah. Whereas Jesus comes down and he's
through the state. Your access to God or to the divine is through the state.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe I'm just wildly speculating.
No, that is the history of Christianity. Because like Jesus comes along and he's like, "Hey, we're all the children of God, and the route to heaven is inside yourself, and you have to look inside and meditate and become male as female and female as male, and all these kind of things." And also throw away the commandments and don't worry about them too much. Love thy neighbour as thyself and love the Lord thy God. I'm not even sure he said Lord. And then 300 years later, a group of Roman patriarchs are like, how can we put this on a t-shirt? And we're basically like, well, okay, we're going to put it in a book and everyone's got to do what it says in the book. And also we're going to call God's second in command Caesar. And the Pope was the name for Caesar. One of Caesar's epithets was the Pope.
Okay.
So they're basically like, and the Romans were like all about worshipping people over God anyway. They used to destroy gods everywhere they went and put a temple to Claudius, like there is in Colchester here, or the temple to Caesar, or the temple to Augustus, or whatever. And in our calendar system, we have July named after Julius Caesar, and August named after Augustus, and a 12-month system that makes no goddamn sense.
In a lot of traditional calendars, the like periods of time are named after things that are happening in the environment at that time of year, which is really nice.
Yeah, I would like to go forward to a more pagan system that here in Britain that we produce for ourselves, which is, this is the month of the oak. This is the month of the acorn. This is the month of the X, Y, and Z. Like with the old lunar tree system, basically, that I don't know well enough, but they talk about harvest moon and this moon and that moon.
And we had the strawberry moon.
Strawberry moon, yeah.
Last time, because that's the moon when the strawberries are ready.
Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense. It also teaches you something about your relationship with the world, and you don't need to know how many days of the month there bloody are, because there's as many days as there are until the next full moon, which is about 28. It's like everyone can know that, and like it fits well with our week system anyway, so why aren't we using that? And then you're coordinating with the seasons, and what I've noticed more and more is I tune into the lunar cycle and the seasonality of food and the seasonality of how I feel during spring, summer, autumn, winter, that me and my friends are having similar things, similar personal experiences at similar times, because we're tuning into the same cycles, like we're tuning into the cosmic clock. So of course things are going to happen more or less in similar rhythms to each other. Whereas if the cosmic clock you're tuned into has nothing to do with neither your bodily cycles nor the natural cycles, but just what some person thought was the number of days that should happen, it's like, well, it's not surprising that everyone just feels a bit out of sync with everything. So I would like, for me, the spiritual life of the community, which would look different in each place, would be built around whatever the local thing is. If the salmon are coming upriver, then that's a local ritual. If the farmers are collecting the blackberries, then that's a local ritual, and you have got your jam making festival and your pickling festival and so on. Every morning in the highest place in the community, people gather to watch the sunrise and sing. Every evening in the highest place in the community, people gather to watch the sunset and sing. Like, not that you have to do those things, but like that those rituals are constantly there to remind you that you are part of an ever interchanging, ever growing, exchanging web of life, and you depend on the sun to live, and you depend on the seasons of the moon to live, and you depend on the rhythms of nature to live. You depend on the bees to live. You depend on the plants that you eat to live. You depend on the animals that you share to live. And pretending that that's not the case, pretending that we have mastered death, that we shall, that we shall never be hungry again, does not make it so that there is no more hunger in the world. We have enough to feed everyone, and we're not sharing it. Whereas, like, we can use that technology in accordance with the cycles of nature, and like, other technology like greenhouses and like all sorts of other things, to make sure that when we won't ever starve again, but we'll have a much richer diet that will be seasonal, that will be more or less local. I'm not saying no food will come from abroad, but the majority will be more or less local. And you can grow loads of stuff in greenhouses and with the technology that we have in a low energy system that once upon a time you didn't have. So it's a richer life that's less energy intensive, it's more connected to the earth, and it's healthier. It's like, to me, it's obvious, and I think for a lot of people in our generation, that's the sort of, with whatever changes, but I think most people are moving in that sort of direction of understanding.
So there's this quote, well, I'm not sure, so I've read something by Buckminster Fuller where he talks about making the world work for 100% of humanity, but I've seen something something released by the Buckminster Fuller Institute to do with making the world work for 100% of life. I'm not sure if that's something that he said a different place or time that I haven't heard, but or if it's their take on it. But I often think of that as what I'm trying to find out with this project is how people imagine the world could work for 100% of life. Which reminds me of that thing in Braiding Sweetgrass, the democracy of species or something.
Just talking about pine trees or the redwoods or something.
That there are some people whose vision of utopia is sort of focused around like, how can we make this world as good as possible for humans? And in doing that, you may trample all over like how things can be as good as possible for all the other forms of life that are here, which to me seems really wrong, obviously to you as well. because we're all here. I
Yeah.
don't personally believe that humans, that there's something about our experience of the world that means that it's just much more important to think about that being good than about everyone else's experience being good. I'd like to be part of the democracy of all of the species here on the earth.
Yeah.
And beyond, if there are species beyond the earth, I don't know. But I feel like, I don't know, but I think that possibly, in order to find out if there are species beyond the earth, would involve kind of fucking things up for species here on the earth. So
reminds me of my brother's argument that the reason we shouldn't be using much nuclear energy is not, obviously there's problems with waste disposal and it's vulnerable, but like as a transition fuel is really useful, but we should be trying to use as little of it as possible because that's our space fuel. Okay. We've only got so much of it, and if you can't be using petrol out in space, right? Like you need to keep the spaceship warm with nuclear fission. And like if we want to do space travel in the future, we need to keep as much of the uranium as possible so that we can get to places. I don't know, but
so Buckminster Fuller said another thing about how we have we've been blessed with this very small allowance of fossil fuels. In order to we were meant to use that to figure out how to not need fossil fuels.
Exactly that. I think
and
of it.
He says okay, we wasted most of it, but maybe we still have enough left to be able to
transition in some way. I mean, at this point, it's going to be we've got enough left to build some seawalls around, the ever rising tides. I mean, I think that's true. I think the fossil fuels are a sort of wish dust that we were granted. And there's only so much, and we can wish with it and turn this like incredibly compact, incredible energy source into whatever we imagine. And if all we imagine is the world of the father of metal technology, of fire, then we will build Mount Doom. We will build Mordor. That's what we're building. But if we use that to develop, the post carbon energy infrastructure, then we can live at that level of technology, and that'd be great if we can build it. We can have maglev trains, and we can have solar panels, and we can have a really magnetic levitation trains and stuff, so that we could have public transport that is like high speed, and that you could go, instead of moving avocados all over the world, you have a system where like if you want avocados, you're going to go to Peru with your local produce to exchange and join their avocado harvesting festival, and people can move around. And also I think that should be essential, like mandatory. I think every couple of years anyone who's working should be sort of obliged to go on holiday somewhere far away, because it's insane to spend all your life working at like a single project. It's not healthy, and your community needs ideas from different places and so on. So I like the idea that we're going to live in smaller communities, but people can move around, no borders, no frontiers. Also, I think those communities should be organised democratically, like you say, ecologically democratically. Like if you're living off the local land and you live in relationship with the land, then you're not going to destroy it. Like that's what people do. They alter their environment. First Nations and Indigenous communities all over the world alter their environment radically, but they have to live amongst it, and they don't see the idea that you can bring food from abroad, so you've got to look after your land here. And there's no choice in that matter. Any community that doesn't do that will die out, and ours will die out for that reason. Our culture will change, or will kill everything, but it will die out because it's unsustainable. That's what that means. So you're going to organise your community democratically. Like in any number of ways you could do it. I like the idea that people who are in power are elected by lottery. You've got 1,000 people who are going to co-administer your region or whatever, and they're just picked out at random. And that means that everyone has the interest of making sure that everyone is a very good technician, is a very good negotiator, is a very good communicator, and knows how things work all over the community. And it will be by definition representative. And the education system would be one similarly, where kids, not just education, the family structure will be different in different places. And I'm not going to tell anyone how to organise their family, but it will be much more communal. And the kids will be seen as everyone's responsibility. Mm-hmm. It's not a single mum raising a child on benefits. It's everyone has to look after all the kids, and the kids can stay with all the different adults, and the kids are running around together in probably sleeping in communal creches half the time and stuff like that. Because that's the same thing to do. You as a young couple of young parents will struggle to look after kids by yourself.
All I see with people, even people who are doing an amazing job of raising their kids, they're still like, why is it just us or just me that's doing this? Like, this would only be possible with a whole community.
Yeah, like that old saying, it takes a village to raise a child. I think that's it. I think that's how we've always done it. And
I feel like, I didn't know as a kid growing up that I was missing that, but I think that I can tell the absence of it.
Yeah.
And you meet people, and it feels like there's these huge cultural expanses between people like from the same town, the same country, of the same age, same economic class, like these huge cultural expanses, because we grew up in these little like fragmented units.
Which capitalism pushed us into, which the evolution of like this country pushed us into, as they're taking the land away from the people, they're forcing people into the cities, into living in these like smallest possible units that can reproduce itself. And that's like, we have to be careful when we think about patriarchy as a concept, because like patriarchy is culturally specific. Like it exists in most places in the world in some form or other that I'm aware of. And as I understand it, less so in hunter-gatherer societies, but not necessarily. And I need to read that Dawn of Everything book. But patriarchy under capitalism has a certain form that developed, which Silvia Federici is pointing out, which is you're reducing the community down to this smallest possible family unit, getting ever smaller the nuclear family, and then whilst you're doing that, you're compartmentalizing the work from the so-called economic work which the men do, and the reproductive work which the women do, so that only men are being officially recognized in the technology of the state. Their work is being officially recognized, and women's isn't. And the care work and the teaching work and the reproductive work is all seen as a gift from a manna from heaven, like a grace that women like to give us. And that's a particular form of patriarchy. You can have a system of that's patriarchal where women are still involved in the economy and men take part in the care work. Like that is not necessarily a patriarchal arrangement. But the men are still in charge, and there's still, the use of violence to control and military, whatever. So that's the kind of patriarchy we're under, and the history that we've had that's put us into these sort of single mother and father homes that are really anachronistic. Like there's no such thing as that in most of human society. It means you've got one female archetype and one male archetype. So if you're if either of your parents is in any way not like fully adjusted as a human, which is to say the whole population, like you are pretty fucked as a child in terms of you are going to take on the neuroses of your parents because they're the only people looking after you to some extent, and like the luckier ones of us have got grandmas and grandfathers and uncles and aunts. But like if you start from the center of capitalism and move outwards to anywhere in the world, the families get bigger. right? Like even if you go to the Catholic capitalist countries, their families are much bigger, right? Like my Spanish family is much bigger than my like family in England. And that's because Catholic culture was much more communitarian than Protestant culture, and Protestantism is just like capitalism on steroids. Like it's like no joy, no pleasure, no femininity, no color, no rituals, no connection with nature. You know, you've got to work, and you've got to work, and you've got to work, and you've got to work because Arbeit macht frei, and that's the mentality of the thing. It's got to turn everything you do into a readable number of currency that you exchange, and that's the only thing that exists. So that technology of money and that technology of bureaucracy and accounting that comes from this corner of the world is then the like ideological lens that you look at everything, and you turn everything in your head, like the fact that in our culture you can talk about a woman being a 9 or a 4, you know, and this is the mentality of the incels, right? They're reducing like the idea of attraction and beauty into this abstract number, and they're like, why can't I get a girlfriend who's at least a 7? And it's just, it's insane. It's insane. But that's the logic of our system. That's the logic of having this universal solvent that exchanges everything called money, and that's the logic of like this bureaucracy. It turns everything into a readable thing. So, and the counter of that is, like Audre Lorde says in Uses of the Erotic, or Silvia Federici says, as I understand it, is like the erotic, the magic, the spiritual, the divine, the connection and relationship, rather than this sort of abstract quality of a thing called its number or worth or whatever. It's like, forget the numbers. They don't exist. There's no such thing as numbers. It's just a human game that we're playing. It doesn't exist. The only thing that exists is you, me, in connection with each other, in connection with all the other beings, right? Like relationships are the only thing that exists. And yet we're in this system that just wants to turn everything into a number and a readable barcode so they can control it. I lost my track of what I was saying a little bit there.
So you see the world that you would like us to live in as one that's a lot more kind of fluid and dynamic in how it's organized, the way that the natural world is, you know, like when you go to a place where nature's just doing its own thing, there are lots of like very functional processes taking place. Like it's aiming for things, it's optimizing for things, but it's not doing that by like putting, like assigning a number to everything and like putting it into a grid or whatever, you know. It's like allowing the processes to feed into each other and kind of evolve into what's working. Yeah,
there's not even a question. From a scientific perspective, an ecology is healthier than a monoculture, right? Like, and from any perspective, like you don't want a military, even like from the most masculine perspective, you don't want a military that's all snipers, right? Like you want interrelating, interweaving. You want the different parts that make up the whole.
You don't have a football team that's all strikers.
Yeah, exactly. But for some reason, we have a food system that's all wheat, right? Or all rice, and we have an economy that's all money. Right, and this way of thinking that's all time. How much time and efficiency can I get out of this thing? It's like, this is a kind of psychosis that we're all living under. Whereas if you put that aside and you say that what is nourishing, what is beautiful, what is fun to, enjoyable to live, what is connects you to your heart and your purpose and your soul and your community and each other, is relationships. Relationships with each other, relationships in between us and the natural world, relationships with plants, relationships with animals, relationships with whatever you want to call God or Tao or the source or the spirit or the sun or the moon. You know, those relationships are what nourishes us. That's what we have always lived off of, because we don't live abstractly in space. We live on Earth, dependent on the food that we gain from Pachamama, dependent on the sun's rays and dependent on the weather and dependent on the other things. So to deny all those things exist, to deny the importance and power of women, to deny the erotic, to deny the spiritual, which is what the process of capitalism was, to move women out of the spheres of power, to move women out of the economic sphere, to move women out of the sciences. And like in Federici's book, she's talking about how there were more female surgeons in Germany in, I'm going to make up a date, but basically like the 1530s, than there would be again until the like 1950s, right? Like there were like women were taken out of all the professions, and they were taken out of all the decision making. They were taken out of every field that we could get them, to domesticate them and make them baby making blowjob machines that mop up after us.
Yeah, when you phrase it like that, I understand a lot better why that happened.
Like basically, it's like it's gonna be 500 years before we get a sex doll and Roomba. So how can we? Yeah, no, it's grim. It's really fucking grim, and our culture is still that. You know, is still the descendant of that. We've only started to name that fact in the last couple of generations. So we're still living under that. So in a word, like the other thing about like balloting everyone by lot is that you'd have at least 50% women, which would be a marked improvement on pretty much every country in the world, apart from like Rwanda and Cuba or something like that. Like there's a few countries in Africa that have more than 50% female representation, but there's very few. And actually, I think it should be more like 60 to 70% female representation for the next 300 years, whilst we like undo the damage of patriarchy and like try and like rebalance this bizarre society we live in.
Is the eventual world that you'd like to see one in which men and women are totally equal, or one in which it's more of a matriarchy than a patriarchy, or one in which the idea of men and women is kind of irrelevant, like that's just not a part of how we think about like important levels of social organization?
I think all three of those.